Now you should hear me. Is that better? Now, don't make me start over, okay? Can we go from where we were? Okay, all right. So, now, anybody who comes to Hong Kong, that's one of the first things you notice if you're from a Western culture. The thing is that if you notice it, the Chinese are not reacting the same way that you are. Like, it's quite common to see a Westerner when someone doesn't hold the door open for him. It's, ugh. But the Chinese don't do this. The reason is, as they say in Arkansas, if your mama didn't tell you it's wrong, it ain't wrong. Now, I used to live in Arkansas, and I'll give you an example. A lot of people in Arkansas chew tobacco. And the thing about chewing tobacco is you have to spit. Now, when you're outside on the farm or on the baseball field, no problem. You can spit. No one really notices. But when you're inside, then you got to have this little cup with you. And you can imagine this is not a pretty sight. When you're driving your pickup truck down the road, well, then you just spit outside the driver's side window. And then the driver's side door is covered with brown streaks. But the point here is the people in Arkansas, Mama didn't tell them that is rude. Probably because Mama chews tobacco. But this is one of the things that we deal with all cultures when they come into contact with each other. Because I am given one set of rules about what is correct, what is polite, the way to act. And other people have a different set of rules. There's many different cultural norms. I'm sure most of you have been to Thailand. In Thailand, you aren't supposed to touch someone on the head, very rude, and don't point your feet at a Buddha, especially the soles of your feet, and don't say anything bad about the king because they'll put you in jail. Well, okay, fine, I'm willing to abide by their culture, but I don't really agree with it. It's not a big deal to me from my culture whether I point my foot at a Buddha or not, because I don't really believe in that. But to them, it's a very, very huge thing. So you can see we've got some cultural issues. So what we're going to talk about today is there such a thing as Christian culture? Can you say that there is something that transcends or displaces the indigenous cultures in any society? Okay. Now, one of the things just to get you thinking is, you all know this guy. But really, what does he have to do with that? Now, speaking of Christmas, we all know that, he is actually St. Nicholas, who we're not really sure who St. Nicholas was, and maybe he's Greek, and I'm not sure, but the reality really is that it's Santa Claus. And if you come from America or the West, you call him Father Christmas if you're from the UK. But Santa Claus and the Christmas tree are a big part of Christmas, an increasingly large part of Christmas. But they really, really have nothing to do with the original holiday. But in my tradition, in my culture, they're seamless. The two fit together. You kind of find a way to say, well, we're giving to people on Christmas Day and the whole thing and the lights. But really, it's just something that my culture does that other cultures don't do. Now, one thing we could do is we could decide that what we really need to do is go back to first century Christianity. Now, not all Christians dress like this. Actually, most Christians dressed a little bit more like this. Probably, we've got two pastors here who I read what this guy on the left is wearing. It's either called a himation or himation or something like that. I don't know. And you wear it over your tunic. How many people even know what a tunic is? And you could wear it correctly. Okay, I'm glad to see it. You guys know a tunic. But now you can see it starts to get ridiculous. If you say, well, we want to be like the people were in first century Christianity. That's the source. That's where it comes from. Let's all dress like these guys, because that's part of it. Well, as you know, they had a different worldview than you and I do now. For one thing, they thought the world was flat. And they also didn't let women vote, which isn't a big problem because they didn't vote either, okay? There was no democracy back then. So when you think about it, maybe we really, really don't need to go to first century Middle East to understand Christian culture. One guy who did try to bridge the culture gap was named Matteo Ricci. Some of you may have heard of him in the early 1600s, late 1500s. He came out here to China. He was a Jesuit priest. And he really, really opened the door. He was the guy. And he came to China, and he had the idea when he got here, I'm going to learn Chinese, I'm going to read and speak Chinese, I'm even going to dress like the Chinese. Now, Matteo Ricci had the idea that when you go into a culture, there are certain cultural norms that they have which are not religious. And if they're not of a religious nature, they are just traditions. And those should be respected. He felt that the cultural traditions of China should be respected. Also, it is a way to connect with the Chinese people if you know what their traditions are and if you can connect with them. Well, some people didn't agree with Matteo. Now, he believed in what he called the Chinese rites, that it's okay to allow the Chinese to follow traditional customs. And in 1645, the Vatican said, yep, that's okay. We agree with you, Matteo. It's no problem. However, the Dominicans did not like this. And there was a Dominican missionary who wrote to the Holy See and said, this is not true. Actually, all of this stuff is religiously based. Confucianism is religion. And we think that Matteo Ricci is wrong. So, as they do, the Vatican issued what is called a propaganda fide, or those of you who are in the business can tell me if I've pronounced that one right. And what they said was, no way, you can't do this anymore. So, from that point forward, for about 200 or so years, anyone who came over to China, initially the Catholics, but later the Protestants, came and said, well, you got to follow our way. We are Christian culture, and Christian culture for about 200 years pretty much equated to Western culture. And some of you, I know that your dear son, your innocent young son, is not aware of this one phrase which came as an example of the imposition that missionaries would impose on locals, because they wanted to change everything about their customs. You had to do it my way. You have to dress my way. You have to act the way I act. This is where the term missionary position comes from. So they were very concerned about the people that they were trying to bring to Christianity. Okay, so when you look at any culture, there would be some things that are religious. There are some things that if you are going to introduce Christianity, you can't do both at the same time. Now, this is a wide open subject. There are many people, many Christians today, both here in Hong Kong and in the Western world, will say no yoga. Okay? Now, some people it's like, oh, it's just an exercise. But to other people, no, this comes from a religious tradition, and if you practice yoga, that's in conflict with your Christian beliefs. There are other issues. Here in China, feng shui, as we would call it here, or feng shui, as they call it on the mainland, it's also called geomancy. Some of that is just, I think another word for it is rip-off, because when you can get a guy coming in and saying, oh, yeah, actually you need to change this shirt and you need to sit over right here, that'll be $5,000. Okay, now, however, with feng shui there can be a plausible reason that some of this makes sense. It is the correct alignment of a location, a person, a situation with the local background or the geographical situation you find yourself in. But that's one area where people are saying, well, what do you think about feng shui? Not sure. Ancestor worship, is it good or bad? Veneration of your descendants, any problem with that? One thing that probably we could all agree on as Christians is lucky numbers. Probably we would discourage you from having 828 on your license plate, because you are then imputing something else other than God with your own personal well-being. You're thinking that, if I have a lucky number, then all will go well with me. This is something that Christians don't normally believe in. But these are just some of the examples where when you enter a culture, you don't want to come in and say, well, all of this, you got to be like me. You've got to dress like me. You got to act like me. But you have to deal with some of the things that are part of that culture. Now, around the middle of the 19th century, some of the guys started to actually get the idea. The Protestants, when they came in, Hudson Taylor, the guy with the cool beard on the upper right, and then the other guys, I'm not sure, but all of them are missionaries. They came in and they said, look, we're going to follow the Matteo Ricci approach. We like that concept of trying to understand the Chinese, to try and connect to them and meet them where they are. Okay. So Hudson Taylor followed kind of the same thing that the Apostle Paul did when he went to Athens. That's when he was saying, I'm all things to all people. The concept there is that I am not going to let anything be a barrier between you and the gospel. Nothing that I would do that would prevent you from accepting the gospel. So, by the way, these guys, like Hudson Taylor, you've heard of the Three Self Church in China. A lot of people think, Three Self Church, that's kind of like the government, run church, and the house church, that's the good one. Well, actually, the Three Self Church was something introduced by Western missionaries in the middle of the 19th century, and they came up with Three Self actually means self-propagating, self-organizing, and self-funding. They thought, because they'd failed in India, they'd failed in other places where they came in with this ill-conceived idea of you got to be like us, you got to sing the songs that we sing, dress like us, and it wasn't working in India. And they said, when we go to China, let's give them this Three Self concept where they are evangelizing, they are raising up their own leaders, and they are keeping their own church going. That later, of course, was adopted by the communists because it was very, very useful as a way of avoiding outside influence. But the Three Self movement actually comes from these Protestant missionaries. Okay. Now, we get to the big question. The big question is there something that is really, really basic Christian culture? That you can forget all this other stuff. It's actually just trappings of our own worldly society. Is there not something that we can identify as Christian culture, which is really one size fits all? And of course, this is the question. I should have put it up so you could read it while I was talking, but now you can. So, here's the answer, of course. It's all about the hair. You can read this along with me, or you can read it silently to yourself. This comes from the Apostle Paul, okay? Very adamant, very important. I noticed that none of you women, because I was paying attention, none of you had your hair covered earlier today. Now, this is Scripture, ladies and gentlemen. Paul said it. But we don't follow it. We're not really paying attention because it's not the main point. He was trying in his letters to reach people where they were. And yes, there were things that applied back then. But this is not the point, because it's not all about legalism. It's certainly not all about the hair. It's easy to get caught up in the details and the rules of being an observant Christian. The Jewish people had the same problem. The guys who really had the big problem called the Pharisees. And you read all about them because they and the scribes were identified by Jesus as missing the point. So it's very easy, if you're focusing on the hair, if you're focusing on any of the laws that you must obey, then you are missing the point. So, now I get to my thesis statement of this lecture, is that I believe it is clear from the teachings and life of Jesus Christ that you could identify the way that Christian culture would be. and it would be significantly different than humanly developed cultures. Now, you guys would probably agree with that anything developed by humans is not going to be as good or as important as what Jesus Christ himself has shared with us. Okay, so here's some of the stuff we all know we have to do. You have to love your enemy. Don't resist an evil person. Now, all this stuff comes from what's called the Sermon on the Mount. We all know it. Some of us can quote it directly. But this was the time, and this is what our religion sees as this is the statement. This is how Christians act in the kingdom, okay? You got to love your enemy. Oh, I can probably do that. Don't resist an evil person. Really? What does that mean? Don't judge. Don't judge at all. This is one that you don't really, it's in there. It's in the Sermon on the Mount, but we don't pay attention to this one. Account for every careless word. That's a tough one. Divorce. Jesus is pretty clear about that. Except for cases of marital infidelity, don't divorce. Now, if you want to read this as a legalist, you're going to get caught up in it again too. Because what you're going to focus on is no divorce. That's the point. It's a law. Jesus said it. You can't do it. Okay, don't judge. I'm warning you. Don't judge. Now, most people just say, yeah, this doesn't really work for me. But it's not about the rules. It is about the heart. Now, these are first century Christians. I dressed them up a little bit. So you probably don't recognize them. They're not wearing the hymation. But these guys are saying, you know what? There's more than the rules because it's all about the heart. By the way, the other things that Jesus said, about gouging your eye out and stuff, we don't do that either, right? Because there'd be a lot of blind people walking around Hong Kong. So, okay, we get part of the thing about legalism. But the best example of this in practice, if you want to look at what it means, what Christian culture would be like, is something that we also want to avoid. It comes in Acts, I think it's 15. Well, anyhow, you know the story. It's where, finally, wow, Jesus actually, we thought he was dead, but he rose up and he's come back. He gave us the Holy Spirit. He left, and now we're here, and we are all working together, and we share everything that we've got. It is, Acts 5. Sorry about that. And you guys know all this. We pay no attention to this. This is the one example of the first believers, how they were acting when they were filled with the Holy Spirit, and they have gotten the message. A lot of these people knew Jesus personally. They had met the guy. Okay? This is how they acted. I'm an American. There's no way anyone, especially the evangelicals, are going to want to do this. Because it's not what we do in America. We don't do this because this, as we know, is socialism, right? Could even be communism, not quite sure. But it's just not what we do. So it's kind of like covering your hair, right? We don't do that either, so we can forget this part too. I would argue that, no, you can't. This is what it's all about. Okay. Everything was going fine until this guy showed up. Now, I know all of you recognize him, but I'll hold off on identifying him because bear in mind what Christianity was doing. It came from, as I mentioned, this one pretender to the throne, Jesus, is killed by the authorities, just like all the pretenders to the throne are. This was not uncommon to have messiahs come up in first century Israel. And he died, and then lo and behold, there was still a religion going based on what this guy taught. That had never happened before. And even more than that, they were saying that he had come back to life and he was the Son of God. Over the next 2.5, 3 centuries, this creed, this religion, swept the largest empire that the world up to that point had ever known. And it did it without firing a shot. There were no battles. There's no recorded battles between Christians. We know they were persecuted a lot, didn't fight back, but they had a message of love. They had a message of peace and of following the word of Jesus Christ. They took over an empire. In fact, this guy, as you all knew, that is Constantine. he saw that this was so successful, he just adopted it. And then things kind of went downhill from there, because that allowed human culture to invade and really overtake Christian culture. That's why you got guys like this, the Inquisition, torture as a means of eliciting confession, and a lot of other stuff. We as Protestants would say, including the Pope. The concept of a Pope was created when humans started to take over Christianity. This is what happens when a human culture absorbs the Christian culture. It gets diluted. Christianity actually was added to most cultures. So what they do is they absorb it, kind of like an amoeba or a sponge. And you take some of the good parts, like, be nice to people and that kind of general stuff, a few laws, but you still absorb it. And you see that to this day. Okay. Now, one thing I want to tell you. Okay. Oops. Sorry. I hope no one saw that. I'll get to the main point, because I do believe, and it is my thesis, that there is something which is Christian culture. In almost the entire word, it is not really practiced. And this is a problem. About 1/3 of the people on the planet today identify themselves as Christians. About 30% of everyone on the planet says, I'm a Christian. And we know that a little bit of yeast should be able to work its way through a very large amount of dough. If 30% of the people on the planet are really Christians, you'd think we'd be able to see something a little bit different than what we see now. But I suggest that the reason we don't is actually we've just absorbed, taken over elements of Christian culture and don't follow Christian culture. I'll give you 2 examples of what Christian culture is. You all know the story about the